hour, 45 minutes here? Excellent. So we don't have anybody from Massachusetts or New York or Maine. Who participates like in the Vermont Current Use Program? Excellent. How about, do you work in natural resources, from education to logging to everything in between?
Can there be an ED on that?
Absolutely. Perfect. Okay.
As in retired?
Yeah, or emeritus, yeah. Perfect. Well, that is really helpful to me, so thank you. And I know we'll hold questions for the end, but if you have some little clarification or something in the middle, feel free to jump in. We got a nice group here, so it can be a good conversation. And I'm also not used to speaking in front of tons of people, so it'll be nicer to have it be a conversation. So I'm going to do a little bit of introduction to myself, just talk about who I am. I once had a professor who really made it clear to me how important it is to kind of tell an audience about what your own biases are around something. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to talk about ecological forestry, kind of some definitions and a little bit of history there. A lot of my talk is going to be about kind of mindsets and how we think about going into things, because there's a lot of, what defines ecological forestry is a lot of how you go into it. And every good story needs an antagonist, so I'm going to talk about kind of the barriers to getting this stuff done on the ground. And behind all that, I'm going to really be operating on the assumption that it's a good thing that I want to see happen, and so there are barriers to it. I'll talk about a lot of things that I'm doing, and things that I think we could be doing better. I'm Alex Barrett. I'm a consulting forester. I grew up in North Egremont, Massachusetts, which is like the southwest corner of the state. And I grew up in a home that was made out of wood that my father sawed at his commercial sawmill. So I come out of like a wood family. I studied liberal arts in college and then was teaching high school for a while and got inspired to go into forest management by some folks I was working with as I led a maple syruping program for some high school kids. And that sort of kicked me on a journey in my mid-20s, and here I am. I worked in Connecticut for a while. Now I work in Vermont. I'm licensed in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, because I live kind of where I can strike all of those. So it's really interesting to see how different states are doing things. Kind of a sidebar, but different states are very supportive or not of a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight. Also, I'm a consulting forester, so I make money working, helping people think about their forests. So that's important to just think about. This is my livelihood. I've chosen to be in it, but it certainly colors how I think about management. Underlying a lot of what I do is, I really like the idea of a biodiverse forest. And that's kind of obvious to a lot of people, but it's also, I think, just important to put it out there and say, this is important to me to have a lot of cool things in the forest. Sorry, we all good? Okay, yeah. Excellent. This is like the most beautiful ash tree I've ever seen. It's in West Windsor. It goes up like a monster pine tree, but it's an ash tree, and it's amazing. But I'm also totally into making things out of wood. We live in a wood environment. It's a wonderful resource we have here, and I'd much rather see it made out of wood than concrete or steel or plastic. So that's just a bias of mine that's important to know. And to do that, I'm really into active management. I like to do things in the woods. Behind all that, I do have a feeling that we need to do some restoration on a lot of our landscape. I'll talk about that a fair bit during this talk. And I think people, we're in and a part of nature. We're not sort of this removed thing who sort of watches nature from afar. We're in it. We've shaped it pretty heavily, for good or for bad, and we have some responsibility there. A fair bit of my talk, since I work for a company called Longview Forest, which is sort of a design-build forest management company. So we're 30-odd employees at this point, and I lead a group of consulting foresters, but we also have a number of logging crews, site work crews. We do a fair bit of forest mulching and shredding of huge invasive plants and things like that. So I'm pretty biased toward thinking that contractors and loggers make a huge impact in what I'm going to talk about. Without them, we're not doing a lot of this stuff. And that's a huge issue. If you start sort of playing out the math, there's nowhere near enough contractors to do the things that we actually could aspire to be doing. We certainly don't know everything. I certainly don't know everything. So being real humble, keeping your eyes open. I hope that if I say something terribly wrong tonight, you'll correct me and tell me that, because you're always going to be learning things. And it's also like you put a bunch of stuff out, you live in your own little bubble, and then you put stuff out in front of a lot of people, and you realize like, oh my God, I had that totally wrong. And I'm going to talk about the triad, which is a forest management sort of paradigm that really influences a lot of what I think about. And I'll jump in there first. So this is just a landscape management regime idea of like, how do we think about a forest? How do we think about this thing all around us? And it has the framework of, we want to have a small area that's really intensively managed for wood. We like that, either in a plantation form or just really intensive management of natural forests. Then we want to have a bunch of reserve forest, just like what Sean was saying, sort of areas that are left aside, they're special, we're not going to mess with them. And then in that sort of Swiss cheese matrix all around those things, we want to be practicing ecological forestry, which is managing for multiple uses, and I'm going to talk a lot about that tonight. But that sort of three-way thing of thinking about the forest is very much what drives a lot of how I think about the woods. And hopefully tonight I'll explain how I'm doing it. So ecological forestry. People have heard this a lot before. It's in people's vocabularies a little bit, sort of. It's out there all the time. You hear it a lot if you pay attention. And I think a cool thing about Vermont is that we happen to have a number of advocates of this here. Namely Tony D'Amato, who's a professor at UVM, who is one of sort of the leading intellectual voices on this, I would say. And then I guess recently Ethan Tapper was here talking, and he's a daunting speaker to follow, but he's a wonderful guy, and he has a lot of really interesting thinking about ecological forestry. So there is a fair bit of sort of academic or esoteric debate about ecological forestry. But for me, it's really about putting the forest first, while recognizing that like we need some things from the forest, and we ask a lot of the forest. And we're trying to emulate natural models in the forest. So we're looking at the forest, thinking how it reacts to things, trying to emulate that. And the framework that Brian Palick and Tony D'Amato have, which I really like, and I'm going to kind of base the beginning of my talk on, is thinking about these four sort of pieces, like continuity, complexity, timing, and then sort of the context of what you're doing it all in. The things that are a little more unique to me, so this is like, you can go read articles about all this and think about it and debate whether you like it or not and how you might apply it. But the things that have sort of bubbled up in my own professional world are thinking about how to bring this to landowners through kind of educating and also kind of empowering people to do things, supporting contractors and loggers as they actually do it, which is really challenging, and those folks are often taking on quite a bit of risk in a number of these projects that we do. And then, so I do a lot of work in the current use program in Vermont, which is what I wanted to know. So if you have 40 acres, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to participate in ecological forestry at a grand scale. But your 40 acres might be very important in relationship to the 1,000 acres near you. Like, I was talking to Naomi right as I came in here, and she was describing how beautiful it is out here, but it's dark, so I can't see it. She's like, we have this, it's 27 acres, it's mostly field, there's stream, we're doing these cool plantings, and that's amazing. And it's in juxtaposition to 1,000 acres of forest right near here. So taking these things together and understanding that is really important for me to be able to do ecological forestry. And lastly, like, a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is pretty messy and somewhat complex. And a big part of my job as a practitioner is to let it be complex, but not get into like the unmanageable. Because if you get into the unmanageable, then you're just letting it do its thing, which is cool, but not what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to just breeze through these 4 sort of pillars of framework, and I have captions on most of my photos, so for those of you who like to read. But the idea of continuity is really important. So it's the idea of how do we have live trees, dead trees, arrangements of trees, plants, all sorts of things on the landscape across long time frames and potentially through multiple entries of management. And this is in juxtaposition to more of sort of an agricultural forestry model, which would say, let's grow a crop of trees, cut them all down, grow another crop of trees, cut them all down. It's sort of, if you could imagine that this big, beautiful white oak in Westminster is like an awesome tomato plant in your garden that you happen to keep for every year that you grow your garden, that would be the equivalent. That's challenging. There's like a lot of communication issues there. Like, foresters don't live for 200 years. So like, how do you get that into the record so that the next person comes along and doesn't screw it up? Complexity. I hinted a little bit, like, if things get too complex, I worry that we're not going to do things. So we are managing at really small scales with kind of intimate connections of stuff here in Vermont particularly. So keeping that complexity and striving for it is important. It's a main part of ecological forestry, but I also want to be like pretty eyes wide open about like, if you're only doing one tree at a time in different ways and things, it can just get unwieldy. The timing and context are sort of bigger picture things. For timing, it's back to kind of emulating natural disturbances and thinking about how might we treat this thing on a little bit longer of a time frame, giving certain processes a little bit longer time to develop, and watching. I think one of the most challenging things as a consulting forester is taking on too much land and then not paying enough attention to it. So I've heard like a number that I really like is if you're a forester, you should be paying attention to like maybe 10,000 acres in Vermont. And you have a lot of consultants who manage 80,000 acres. And so you're not monitoring or caring for something if you're not seeing it but once every 10 years. And so that's a real challenge. And I'm not going to talk about like forester and logger workforce development too much, but we need more of these people. And then the context, like my example of the North Branch environs here, like that's really important. You need to be thinking about what's going on nearby and also like what happened before. And you can show up and do a wonderful ecological forestry project, but if you never come back there, it may or may not go well in the long term. A ton of what I'm doing out there, like the mindset that I go into it or that we go into it with really, really matters. And our forests here, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this sort of story of, pretty aggressive clearing and sort of a haphazard regrowth that we're currently working with now on a lot of our land. And I don't quite know how to set up this dichotomy, but I play a fair bit of board games with my children, so I think about the Settlers of Catan. And so I think about sort of a settler mentality and like a steward mentality. And like on this landscape, like we're all standing on top of a fair bit of what I would call the settler mentality, which is come in, clear some land to farm. You need to heat your home in the winter, so you put up 20 cords of firewood and burn it all winter. And you're sort of extractive, and you have to do that to survive. And that's what I think of as like the settler mentality. And we're still clearing house sites in Vermont. We're still perforating forests and extracting things, or even sort of mining timber to a certain degree, which would be where I would say we're showing up, hoping we find something good, and then taking it home, as opposed to like cultivating it and taking care of it over time. So it's hard to like not sound judgy talking about that, but I will try to just be very even-keeled in my voice, because I live in a house that's on something that was forest at one point, and it's not forest right now. And we all do that, and that's okay. But the sort of responsibility and the privilege of caring about that resource is like, every now and then it's good to step back and be like, yes, I'm not sneaking out tonight to like go cut more wood to feed the fire. Like we're all living in a situation where generally like we have a standard of living that like doesn't require a huge constant settler mentality. So we can talk about stewardship a little bit more, but it's good to just, I think, recognize that and think about that triad as you're doing it. What are these pieces? And just, try to be honest about what you're doing and when you're doing it. Because sometimes I'll be doing like a really cool ecological project and then the landowner will be like, and I'd really like to open up this view. And you have to be like, am I going to do that or not? And like, I often do, but like, you just be honest about that. This is not an ecological forestry opening. This is a view. So like the sort of barriers and things that I'm going to talk about tonight and then sort of use as a springboard to talk about the cool stuff that I think we're doing or we could do are, the forest management culture that we live in. How do we think about the landowners who make decisions around their land, how they want to honor or not honor the legacy of the people who did things before them. Life gets in the way. Forests are, we manage a lot of properties in the current use program, and I've been here in Vermont for 10 years, and I've seen properties that change hands 4, 5, 6 times in that time frame. Like even a timber harvest that is marked that changes hands 2 or 3 times before it actually happens. So that's a serious barrier to actually doing stuff well. But life gets in the way of stuff. I'll talk a fair bit about kind of regulatory frameworks and rules and how that might get in the way of some of the ecological forestry that I'd like to see happen. I'm going to talk a fair bit about contractors and how their frameworks are really important in this work. And then I'm going to get into the sort of professor of your professor problem, which is kind of a genealogy of ideas. And I'll get into that a fair bit. So in the forest management culture front, I think kind of the main thing that I bump into is just a concern about like messiness. And it's just sort of the fact that if you drive by somebody's lawn and they haven't mowed their lawn in a while, you like wonder what's wrong. And that percolates right through to a lot of forestry. A lot of times my first conversation with a potential new client is they'll start to tell me about how they're really excited about how they only harvest the dead and fallen wood from their forest to burn in their wood stove. And they're really excited about that because it cleans up the forest and it's great. And I have to explain to them how nature's pretty messy and how they should not do that. And I talk that through. But that's a really hard conversation to have, and it's built on the culture of how we think about the forest. The tools that we have, some of them are rather dramatic, and we want to try to have them do very careful, specific things. So that's a challenge and a barrier. Like this photo here is, basically a 10-acre clear cut. We left some trees in it, but the forester here who was in charge had been attempting to convince the landowner to do this thing for a wildlife habitat thing, but it was going to have to be a whole tree chipping job. So all the wood was going to have to go out, and the landowner wasn't all that excited about a big road leading. It was quite a ways from any kind of town road. And so they'd been hemming and hawing. They had an NRCS contract to do it. And I didn't even think about this, but one of our loggers was just like, well, why don't they just cut them all down? And we're like, well, geez, the landowner loved it. He was like, let's do that. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. It did something that was very dramatic and really cool. And this is 2 years out treating invasive plants in that clear cut. And there's like oak and cherry that are over my head already. And you're just sort of like, whoa, this is totally amazing. The deer can't really do terrible things in there because it's hard to see, but he's like 8 feet off the ground. Because there's so much old pasture pine that was just dumped on top of itself. So thinking about the tools that you have and where you might apply them, and then what parts of them you might apply. This is out in the middle of nowhere, so we don't have a lot of people wondering about our messy lawn. But engaging with people and just letting them know what's happening and why is really hard and awkward. And that's so in Massachusetts, you have to mail a letter to every neighbor that you're doing a timber harvest in, within 200 feet of the harvest. And it's really onerous and sort of expensive because you have to do it certified mail, but it's wonderful because you put it on everybody's radar. There's no like, oh my God, they're developing a subdivision next to me. It's like, oh, they're doing some forestry. So, that's not a rule that we do in Vermont. People are not really into that, but it could be. And then a really big thing in our forest culture is just a general lack of investment in the forest. We, as a group of people, generally have the mindset that we go do stuff in the forest when it can make money, and when it can't, we don't want to talk about that. And that's kind of not normal compared to a lot of other forestry cultures in the world. And so I'd argue that we have a fair bit of change to think about making there. And I think that's one of the biggest things that's in the way of doing good ecological forestry. People familiar with all the good Vermont conservation design work that has happened out there? No. This is not so much of a challenge, so much of an opportunity. And I think that Vermont itself is really leading on a lot of this, which is both inspiring but also nerve-wracking, because usually the people who lead are the ones who make some mistakes and have to figure things out later. But the state has done a pretty nice job, I think, of thinking through a framework for how we might manage our forests. So that's more of kind of an opportunity, because it helps people like me who don't have the resources or time to do that sort of an analysis to then focus on context and think about what we're doing. 2 years ago at this point, I think, we rolled out the idea of having reserve forests in the current use program, which was a really awesome thing in my mind. It takes a little bit of pressure off sort of the timber focus of that program, and I think it's really positive. However, in that program, there are still kind of regulatory issues and hurdles around management that are in the way. Another great thing that program changed in 2020 was to allow multiple dwellings within a small excluded area in the program. Huge, totally awesome. So there's flexibility there, but you eventually run into little corners of weird things where you bump into issues too. There's a lot of cost share funding out there to do this work. Vermont is a little bit of a funny place with regard to NRCS compared to our neighboring states. We don't dedicate as much money to forest management activities. We tend to focus a little bit more on agricultural things. But not to say there's still a lot of cool opportunities to work with that. However, those come with, yes?
What's NRCS?
The Natural Resources Conservation Service. So it's part of USDA, and it's tasked with enhancing the productivity and wildlife values of the forest. Well, and manure management and crops and all kinds of things.
And do they do grants to the states?
They do they have chunks of money that go to states, and then those are distributed to landowners who want to do cool things in their woods. So it's a really cool program, and there's been a massive influx of money, sort of over the top amount of money into that program recently, which has been a challenge because they don't quite have the staff to do that. But I've been seeing projects in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire where people are getting $80, $100, $200,000 to fix things in their forest, which is really significant, and you can actually fix stuff. But that money is also federal money, so it has a number of restrictions, and it's tied to some different things that I'm going to actually talk about with endangered species. Streams are worth just thinking about a little bit. I had not thought much about this before I was talking to a stream ecologist, and they were describing how many of our streams we've channelized and done weird stuff to run logs down them in the past or do various industrial things with. There are tons of little dams on all our streams and things, so it would stand to reason, but I just hadn't thought about it. And then we put on top of that all these rules around forestry and what you can and cannot do near streams, which is generally an awesome thing. We don't want big machinery running through streams. That's good. But it can also really, if you have a property in Vermont, you probably have a lot of little streams on it. And if you give them each a big buffer, then suddenly you don't have a lot of flexibility to manage or to prepare your forest to be more resilient to something coming. And where I am right now in southeastern Vermont, like we have a lot of hemlock like dying from hemlock woolly adelgid and hemlock elongate scale, and we're very constrained with what we can do around that because there's a lot of hemlock near streams, which is great, but if they're all going to die, then they're not doing their value along the stream, so it's a little bit complicated. The endangered species piece mostly has to do with federal money at this point, and this is largely the northern long-eared bat and the tricolor bat in the work that I do. And they have, you can only do certain activities basically between November and the middle of April to protect bats from disturbance because they're out there roosting and doing their thing. However, a lot of this work is pretty essential to bat habitat and forest bat, bats that are foraging in forest openings and things. So there's a little bit of conflict there. Lastly, this is just kind of into the minutia, but like forest fire laws and slash laws, from 80 years ago, in Vermont, you're not allowed to leave slash within 50 feet of a boundary of a neighboring property, right? So if you have a 10-acre property and you wrap 50 feet all around it, like you suddenly have a much smaller property in which to leave lots of debris and make cool habitat. So there are some sort of, those laws are not particularly enforced, but they're on the books, so we should obviously need to follow them. But they're an impediment to doing good ecological forestry. There's also some laws, there's also some language in that law around keeping main forest roads open for forest fire suppression. This is a forwarder road in the middle of a really nice project. I don't think it's a main road, so I'm happy to put it in the presentation, but it's clearly not accessible to fire trucks. Contractors. The messiness factor is, there's a pretty straight line between our culture, which doesn't love messiness, and loggers being incredibly proud of doing a not messy job, right? And so there needs to be some discussion there, and it's a constant thing to talk about. It's like, I don't want to make that mess because someone's going to then judge me on it, and it's going to impact my future work. So talking that through with people, working with them is definitely a challenge. And there's also like an operational component to this. So if you make a colossal mess in the forest, it's very hard to drive machinery through it or walk through it for that matter. So there's sort of an aesthetic, cultural component, but then just like a straight up operational component. So I don't know if you can see in my photo, but there's a feller buncher in the middle of that thing. This is like a 2.5 acre old field pine situation. He's just cutting them all down and leaving them there. But it was like a little different logging than his usual moves because he was not going to be able to come out the way he came. Or I guess he kind of backed his way out, actually. So that kind of operational component is definitely a challenge. And you're also asking people whose livelihoods depend on this work to take some risk, maybe not get paid in their usual fashion, and that can be really challenging. The last thing I'll say for now on contractors is kind of around, this winter is amazing, right? It's very frozen. You guys apparently have a lot of snow up here. We have none in Rockingham, but it's wicked cold, so the ground's hard. So many loggers are having a great time right now doing their work. But last summer was also lovely, but before that, there was basically 18 months of mud season, right? And so what that does is a lot of our logging workforce tends to do a lot of different things. So, historically, people would go do a fair bit of logging in the wintertime, and then they would move into sugaring during mud season, and then they would work on the farm in the summer and do different things. And they're amazing loggers, great operators, but they're not what you would call career professional loggers, right? And the climate change and the seasonality weirdness that we're having has further challenged that. And so if your mindset is great, I'm gonna go log for 4 months in the cold winter and then I go do my other things, and then you suddenly can't do that, you're not necessarily thinking about changing your model to logging those other 8 months of the year. You're just doing the other things and not doing the logging piece. So that kind of reliability is definitely a challenge. And the machinery piece, the bigger, fancier machinery that can do a lot of things, well is really expensive and challenging to maintain. So that's certainly a barrier to doing a lot of the things that I ask contractors to do in these projects. And the contracts themselves, like you start putting weird things in there and it gets a little more complicated and you have to talk things through a lot more. And last, the professor of your professor. So my professor of forestry, sort of the guy who taught me a lot of things, like his professor was teaching forestry starting like after World War II. And like everybody's mindset was very different then. But those ideas percolate through to me because you're just the product of the professor of your professor. And so you have to be thinking about that. And you know, a lot has changed in the last 75 years, right? Like we're not so concerned about wood scarcity. We make a lot of things out of other things that are not wood, which is sad. But you know, the world has changed a ton, and a lot of those older ideas are great. But you also have to be just thinking about like, oh, my mindset here is being influenced by something from 75 years ago. You know, that scarcity mindset is still very prevalent, and there's a messiness question around a lot of ecological forestry, but there's also sort of like a utilization question, like why are you wasting all that wood? And you have to, that's the sort of scarcity mindset that you see. And we have a lot of wood, it's okay. We can leave some of it in the forest. And you know, thinking that through and shaping that narrative is definitely challenging. And I certainly am not perfect at it because I find myself saying things that I know are not correct all the time. So checking in, being honest about it. And I think the most important take home that I'd give to people who are doing consulting work or forestry work here is that, you know, you're analyzing a situation, you're thinking about it, you're educating the person who you're working with, you're consulting, and then you need to let them lead a little bit because they also have some really good ideas that might be awesome if you can hold your own biases out of it a little bit. Question?
Do you include the price of wood in your ecology?
Yes, and I'll actually have a slide about that in just a second.
Quick question. How do you decide what a healthy forest is? In the context
Yep.
of the talk, as you move
Yeah.
along, can you kind of add that to your...
Yeah, so I think I talk out of both sides of my mouth with that kind of a question. And out of one side, I will say that like there are certain things like invasive plants or very purposefully built monocultures that are pretty not healthy from a forest perspective, and I'm pretty safe to say that objectively like not good. A lot of the other things around forest health are very much human values that we're putting on the forest. And you know, we're a part of it, so I feel okay about that. But it's quite, you know, the sort of nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. There's a fair bit of that in forest health. And so, but out of the other side of my mouth, I will say that when I think about a healthy forest, I think about something that is capable of hundreds of years of self-perpetuation. Like that's kind of a healthy forest to me. And that means that there is disturbance, there's regeneration, there are new trees starting and growing, and we can see a trajectory for them to be big old trees. They're not going to get to be this tall and then disappear over and over again. So I think that self-perpetuation thing would be basically what I think of as a healthy forest. But with the caveat that like the forest probably doesn't really care what I think about it. So that I think is important to recognize too. So I've kind of outlined like some pillars and framework, some things that I see as barriers. I'm going to now hopefully talk mostly about like how do we do this and what are we doing. And I'm going to focus on these 5 things. You know, letting clients lead, and I'll talk quite a bit about what I mean with there. Working with partners, the funding, the support, respecting and supporting the guys and gals who are actually doing the work. They're making it happen. Thinking about how we can evolve our own culture to think about forests a little differently. And then, you know, the foresters like me, we have, you know, we're sort of the influencers in the situation. We're kind of the architects of a lot of these projects, and we have we need to up our game a fair bit. We're trying. I'm going to start with let clients lead, a tale of two trucks. So a thing that you run into a ton, or I run into a ton, is that like you hear people say something like, you could do this really cool thing in your forest, but it's going to cost a ton of money. And there's a scowl and sort of a dropping of voice, and it's very negative. Like, why would you want to spend money? That's terrible. And a mentor of mine 15 years ago said something to me that was really valuable. And he said, just look around at the vehicles that people drive and think about the decisions that they make. And again, it's very hard to say it without sounding judgy, but like, these are two lovely trucks that you can go buy in Claremont, New Hampshire right now. They're on the lot. One of them is $132,000, and one of them is $62,000. They're both F-150s. They're crew cabs. They're lovely. You can put your whole family in them. You can drive around. You can do all sorts of things. They can go off-road. They're reasonable in Vermont winters, right? But there's a $60,000 price difference between these two rigs, right? And we all make these decisions all the time. And this is just sort of a dramatic example that I think about. But there is some financial relativity in the world. And people make decisions based on what's valuable to them. And so to me, when I see people not investing in their forests or not doing things, it's in some cases because they don't have the resources to do that. But in some cases, it's also because they're making other decisions. And that's totally fine. But you know, if they put $60,000 into fixing their forest, like, whoo boy, we'd be in business. And they'd still have a great truck. So, you know, try to withhold judgment. It's a little bit silly, but like, you know, let clients lead. You can tell them a lot of cool things, but then if you end that by saying, you don't really want to do that though because it's expensive, like you just quashed it. And so, you know, explaining, you know, you want to be advocating for your client too and helping them and telling them what it's going to cost. But like, you know, I remember hearing a thing about people donating to to political campaigns and like somebody giving hundreds of millions of dollars. And I was, oh, it's a lot of money. And then the commentator was like, yeah, and for most average Americans, that's the equivalent of, you know, $80. And I was like, well, yeah, that's pretty, it's just money's kind of relative. So ecological forestry, right, it can have a commercial aspect to it. Like we do create value in the woods, you know, that the wood does have value sometimes, but it might not. And, you know, being aware of that and letting people make decisions about what they want to do is really important. And it opens the door to a lot of ecological forestry if you're willing to just be sort of financial neutral with things in the woods. And a good example of this is just, you know, developing really good access to a forest. You know, this was a cleared area already. It needed a bunch of stone. So, you know, the landowner invested, you know, $5,000, $6,000 in developing a really nice, stable access to their forest. This is a property that we wanted to be able to do stuff on, not in the wintertime, because I wanted to regenerate some forest that would be helpful if it was not done in the winter. So they needed to make this move. And they now have some added benefit of being able to get to their cute little cabin, but the main function was like, we need really good access here. But it's a cost, but we just needed to explain that and move forward with it. This is just a little framework of kind of the financials of doing a restoration project. And I'm going to talk about this kind of in the scheme of funding and how we can put together the money to make some of these projects happen. But this is just a little project where we have some stumpage, so some money that gets paid to a landowner for their trees by a contractor. And then they're getting funding from NRCS, from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, to help do some early successional habitat creation. So clear cutting, keeping some trees in those clear cuts, but clear cutting. So they're getting some funding there, and then they're making a bunch of investments in their property. So they are building an access point. The NRCS area involved cutting a lot of trees that had zero commercial value. In fact, they have decidedly negative commercial value. And so to have a contractor come in and do that work, they need to be paid. They're not doing charitable logging. So the contractor in this case, and this gets back to sort of the mixing and complexity of contracts, like the contractor paid the landowner some money for some of their wood, also sent them an invoice for some of the cutting for some of their wood. And then, you know, I, as the forester, managed a small little invasive plant piece to this puzzle. Like, I wasn't comfortable doing some of this opening without dealing with the invasive plants so that they didn't take over the thing that we made. And I also got paid to do that work. So I put all those things together, and like NRCS basically turned a break-even project into something that generated a little bit of wealth for the landowner. And we did a really cool project. So there are funding options out there. And the other thing, the Vermont Conservation Design piece, just that analysis of a landscape scale thing, and then its ability to trickle down to a consultant like me is incredibly helpful. So I don't have time to do that kind of analysis nor the expertise, but I can rely on some guidance and frameworks that are really helpful. So in that way, like, very thankful to Vermont for having done that. There's also sort of like a leverage piece, and this will be sort of in opposition to letting landowners do their thing. It's like sometimes you want to apply a little bit of leverage to get somebody to do something because they're just about there, but they just need a little help to get over the hump of things. So the current use program provides some of that leverage. It requires you to update your management plan every 10 years. So someone like me has to come out and look at your woods and think about it and hopefully prescribe some ecological forest management there. A lot of land is conserved, so it has an easement on it, which also provides some leverage to either do one thing, perhaps to keep a bunch of it as ecological reserve, or to manage some of it, or to protect some special characteristic of that property. NRCS itself is an interesting lever in doing ecological forestry because they fund a lot of practices, but they also tend to like to fund things that are bundled together. So they like to do a couple things at once. They don't just like to, we'll just give you some money for your invasive plants. They like to and let's do some riparian plantings too. We'll help fix this stream and make it nice. So they provide some leverage to include practices that people might not otherwise want to do. And so, that's obviously a little bit of value judgment on my part, but it can be a nice lever to sort of help things move. FPR also and state agencies in neighboring states as well, but they can provide sort of a nice support by either modeling some of this work themselves or making decisions to keep certain areas in certain types of either production or reserve area that can then give me the flexibility to do certain things where I want to do it. Forest Parks and Recreation, so the Vermont State Forestry folks. This example, just a little financial model for how we might think about a project. And it touches on a number of the sort of the complexity, the continuity, and sort of the weirdness of doing some things that are a little not conventional. So here's that project. This is what it looked like at the end, one of the smaller little early successional habitat things. In this case, we did some logging, and then we didn't want to make a terrible mess for the logger, so we actually went in afterward and felled a bunch of trees afterward. So we marked the trees specifically ahead of time and said, this tree's going to get cut. It doesn't matter if you bang it or whatever, but please don't fell this tree. We'll deal with it after. And so that helped the logger efficiently do their thing without costing a ton of money, but then it gave me kind of the ecological mess on top of that I really wanted.
Is that pretty common that you guys go in after commercial logging?
I don't know. We try to do it as much as we can, but it requires a little more planning, and a lot of, in this case, those trees it was an old field. It had a couple beautiful old maples in it, and that we kept, and then this just unbelievably messy pine trees, multiple stems, as big around for me to you. So actually getting those trees on the ground is challenging. So it was not just sort of it was not me with a chainsaw. It was professional faller out there doing it. But it takes a little bit of extra planning, but I think it's really helpful. And so those trees, we'd actually marked them with big Fs so that the logger knew that they were not special, they didn't need to be protected, but that we really didn't want them falling the trees during the project. This project had to happen in the wintertime because of the bats. It's also a fantastic bat habitat now. So supporting loggers and contractors, I think sorry, my projector had been running for so long, I thought it was suddenly like 8:30, and I was like, oh my God, I've gone too long. So engaging contractors in this work. So to do ecological forestry, we need people who are willing to be a little bit unorthodox to do this work. So I think working with people, contractors, to have kind of fair but transparent pricing and arrangements within contracts, listening and respecting to their workflows. Like, I'm not a logger, and so I have to be very careful to propose what I'd like to see happen, and then, oh, that's not going to work. All right, we got to do this instead. Invoicing and tracking is very challenging, I'm sure, in many industries, but in the logging industry, it seems particularly challenging. So it is simply like, can we get some accounting and some tracking to then put together an invoice to charge for this work that you did? And so that kind of building that framework into things. I guess that, a lot of loggers are not used to being electricians, essentially, from an invoicing perspective. Yes?
The last logging I did on my place was 5 or 6 years ago. It was a steep place, kind of difficult to work with, and I had a lot of conversations with my forester about the equipment that was going to be necessary to get in there. And I'm kind of worried about the next time, because I understand that what we had to use was guying, and that the big stuff that's going in now sort of plucks the trees out of the ground and slings it around. What is there to know about equipment now and going forward that may or may not work on lots of tracks in hilly Vermont?
Yeah, it's, so we could do a whole talk on machinery and logging machinery. No, I can go there quickly, because I think it's valuable, and I think it's like a really important topic. So, the traditional Vermont logging operation is a person with a chainsaw and a small skidder and maybe a bulldozer working through the forest. And that machine is generally relatively small scale. It's generally paid off, so it's already paid for. And it's relatively nimble, but it's also generally run by somebody who also has a plowing business and maple sugars and does a little bit of haying and does a little bit of carpentry work when they want to. And that's awesome. That's like a fair bit of America, is like people with multiple hustles, and it's great. But it makes it challenging to do certain types of work. This machine here, the head you're looking at is the dangle head to a cut-to-length processing system. So this thing, reaches out. It's a big tracked machine. It cuts trees down, and then it processes them in the forest. So it makes a colossal amount of debris, which I love because it can be the habitat and protect the little trees from deer. But it is not a chainsaw. But it needs to go on a huge machine. And so there's a conflict there. And that machine, has expensive monthly payments that the contractor is making on it. It needs to work. And also, it may or may not be well suited to logging under a changing climate. Some of that humongous machinery has incredibly low ground pressure and is actually wonderful in a lot of the scenarios that we have. So that mat of brush that's created by the processing system here also protects the soil. So it provides something that machinery can drive on. So I would put a caveat of just say, like, bigger is not necessarily bad, and smaller is not necessarily good. It's, a lot of times in the hands of the operator. So humongous machinery that weighs, 60,000 pounds, of course, if it turns, it's going to hit the ground harder than a small machine. But it depends who's operating that machine to begin with. So I would say, pretty much all the work that I oversee, involves cut-to-length logging, which is processing the wood in the forest and then putting it on a forwarder, which then drives the wood out of the forest. It's essentially like an off-road log truck. That machine also has a grapple, and it can pick up and move stuff, which I appreciate a lot as I want to set up cool habitat things or put in a lot of material to gently go across a stream. So the flexibility of that big machinery is also wonderful. and kind of facilitate some of that ecological forestry work that I want to see. Last thing here I would just say to the foresters is like there's a fair bit of a bar to raise in the professionalism of what we do. And if you have a dwindling logging workforce with expensive machinery that's wonderful but needs to be working, and you show up on a job and there's no map to the project. They're just like, yeah, go cut some wood up there and do the right thing. You're like, that doesn't work. Like, this machine is now idling and I'm trying to find the boundary of your property. And so the foresters who are planning this work can really do a lot to facilitate the ability of the contractor to do their job well. And that's something that I think we are trying to work on, but need to work on more. An example of this is just, any kind of hourly service work that you might add into a project. So traditionally, when we, if a logger is paying a landowner for their wood on a stumpage basis, maybe we add in some hourly service work that then gets billed to the landowner. And that could be something like, doing some timber stand improvement work, thinning out these young trees to pick the ones that we want to grow for whatever reason that may be. So adding in that, thinking about sort of hybrid contracts that involve a little bit more cool work going on, that can be a way to kind of achieve some of those ecological forestry outcomes in using the tools that we have. Changing our forest management culture. Like, if you just start looking on the internet, you will find thousands of websites with lots of amazing resources, and yet things still don't necessarily change at the pace that I might like to see them change. So it's a really challenging topic. I don't have an answer for it. How I approach it is it's kind of one client at a time, which is not very efficient, but is incredibly rewarding because you have really meaningful conversations with people and you explain stuff to them. And even within that relationship, it's like one interaction at a time, which is, again, a tough way to effectuate big change on a landscape. Doing walks and tours, having conversations like what we're having tonight. I think using the power of analogy is very, very helpful in a lot of what I do. Talking about the messiness, the lawn analogy is very helpful to me because we judge people by how their yards look. And I would like us to maybe judge people less by how their forests look if they're messy. But I guess if it's purposefully messy, because like some really terrible logging can look really messy, and you're like, oh great, that's great ecological forestry. Maybe not so much. Peer pressure in this culture that I envision us hopefully developing over time. Like right now, I see it with mostly invasive plants. So one neighbor will do something wonderful to like push back 40 years of bittersweet on their field edge, and then they'll start pushing their neighbor to do the same thing because like it keeps coming back onto their land. So that's one thing that like immediately gets people on board with things, and that peer pressure of, I don't know if it's actually true, but I've heard from some friends who visit Sweden that like if you haven't thinned your young forest at the right time, you get quite a bit of pressure from your neighbors around this. So if you have this forest, they're like, why has Alex not cut his lawn? This is terrible. So, another logger, a mechanic technician from Sweden was here, and he was sort of like, so you guys cut things down, and then you wait 40 years, and you come back, and you hope something good grew? And we were like, yeah, that's kind of what we do. And he's like, wow, it's not what we do. And I'm hesitant to treat the forest like too mechanistically, like it's not exactly just this machine that produces things, but like there's some truth to that. Like you can't just like go away and then come back and hope something good happened. It's like, yeah, we put a roof on the house and then came back 40 years later and like, it hadn't held up. So doing tours, talking to people, spending that extra minute with clients and, doing exciting things. Hopefully it's, we're always trying to figure out what could maybe get people interested in engaging with ecological forestry. And sometimes it's like getting up close and personal. This is a forwarder, which is, the big off-road log truck. these are high school kids. We were trying to inspire them. This is on their school's land. So it was a really cool project. The professional forester culture, I think I've already kind of hammered on the one thing which I would love to eliminate, which is now crossed out. So just let people make decisions about the things they want to do in their forest. I think it's really important. The other piece with consultants, and me included, is that we get really excited about the work that's happening, and we sometimes forget to build in a framework to make sure that it is supporting our livelihood. And we end up either volunteering a lot of time or like not billing for a lot of time that we ought to. So, you know, in New Hampshire, NRCS actually pays for a fair bit of forester time planning work. So that's super cool. In Maine, they have a robust program around same funding stream. Vermont, we haven't chosen to do that. And so a lot of times these bigger complex projects, you're sort of like, you need a general contractor for this thing. Like, who's paying for that? And like, how can you make sure you, the forester, are compensated as part of that? So that can be a challenge. Just being aware of how we speak about things is really important. And then, you know, I started with the example of just cutting it all down instead of putting in a huge whole tree skidding road. So, you know, be aware of the tools that we have and how we might use them well. So, you know, how do you speak up at a conference? How do you, you know, reach out to a colleague on a very prickly, hard to touch topic? Like, some of the more important things that I've learned about doing this work have come from conversations with colleagues just on the phone, like, you know, hey Dan, how are you doing this thing? Oh, I'm doing it this way, this works pretty well. I didn't have a great picture for how to do prickly topics between foresters, so I just picked a prickly topic. And also a shout out to, like, you know, this is clearly cut off with a chainsaw at one point or another, but this baby porcupine was, you know, I took the picture, so I was like right there. But morticulture is a wonderful term. I believe Tony D'Amato invented it, or at least is trying to promote it. But it's the idea of like growing and maintaining dead things on the landscape. So like leaving things to rot and fall down and be amazing and dead. It's really important. So put that in your toolbox as you think about the woods. So having those conversations with your peers, I think, is really important. Just about wrapped up. So putting it all together, you know, here's a small little forestry project. This is in Reading, Vermont, but it has a bunch of the components of what I consider ecological forestry. I, you know, have a really big old hemlock tree that's been there through 2 harvests at this point, and it's going to just be there forever. There's a fair bit of mess and ugliness in the foreground that's wildlife habitat and debris. And the opening is a little weird. It's an irregular shape. It's not just a circle on the land. And it's pretty appropriate to the scale of this forest. So this is sort of a northern-facing, there's spruce and fir as you go further down the slope, but this is kind of a northern hardwood forest. So it's sort of a smaller scale disturbance. It's not a 12-acre clear cut in yucky cabbage pine. This is, you know, an acre or so of opening with some irregularity in it. Yeah, hopefully it will unfold and develop over time. So, in review, I talked a fair bit about trying to change professional forester culture, how we talk about things, how we think about things, how we hopefully will not stand in the way of cool things happening. The big topic of how do we change our whole culture, how do we think about things a little differently. It's important to be working with our partners and the regulations, and also like poking and prodding. Like I talked about streams, like you can get exemptions or waivers to do certain things. With the bats, you can do an assessment, figure out, can I actually do something here in the summertime? So sometimes if you're willing to kind of poke that thing a little bit and ask, you can begin to overcome some of those barriers. Respecting and supporting the folks who are implementing a lot of this work, both their mental models, but also kind of their financial frameworks and their risk. And then I think really my biggest point here, and I hope I've made it really clear, is that to do ecological forestry really well on our landscape here in Vermont, I think a lot of times we have to let the people lead who are controlling that land, who want to see cool things happen, and give them advice, but also not be barriers to them doing neat things that they want to do. So with that, thank you for listening. I just bumped into this tree in the woods this week and I really liked it, so I put it in my presentation. But helmet, there's a hard hat there for scale. So it's a really big, awesome hemlock. It's completely hollow. You can like knock it and it's like wonk, 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 wonk. And it's been sitting in this forest at the base of a ridge, and this is in Alstead, New Hampshire, for a really long time, at least through a couple cycles of management there. And somebody didn't cut it down at one point, and then it stayed, and then it stayed, and now it's going to be there forever. So that's what I really like to see in the woods. So I'd take, and just planting trees. I like planting trees. It's generally not something we do a heck of a lot of, but I'd like to see more of it. You have to protect them from deer too. So questions? Thoughts? Yeah. Yes.
So, Alex, I'm wondering, in Vermont, we know that recreational aspects of the land, I think, have really boomed. I mean, it's one thing to have ski slopes that are all, dealt with, but I live in East Montpelier, and we've got town trails that have finally gotten all linked together, and, and I'm wondering if you have some challenges with, knowing where the snowmobile trails have to go, if you have snow.
Yep.
Knowing where the hiking trails are, just general recreational aspects of, access that people want to have. Are you having to be like really mindful of
Yeah.
that?
And getting back to like the professor of your professor mindset. So in school, like I was taught that like your multiple use forest roads are key for forest management. They are great for skiing and snowmobiling and logging. And like, I've come to the point now where like, that is not true. Like, I just have to put in another road for logging. And that's okay. It's not going to be used to the same degree that multiple use trail is going to be used. And this is not 100%. Like, sometimes we're using them for both. But like, oftentimes, if you listen to the contractor, they actually want to go here, and it's going to be okay, and it avoids that trail. A lot of the logging that we do with the cut-to-length logging creates a lot of debris on the ground, and it compacts the debris into that top layer of soil. So it's very hard to take out afterward. So if you're like, oh, we'll run on this trail, and then we'll pull all the brush out at the end. And you're like, no. Like, very expensive, very disruptive. And so I've definitely evolved my thinking on that.
Just thinking more in terms of, when you talked about a map.
Yep.
You need to know boundaries and how everything,
Yep.
what then happens at the next plot, but also within that whole area, again, your recreational access and, what are the,
Yeah.
what's it going to do? Are you finding that slows things down a little bit, or they have to do a lot of reconsideration based on recreational access?
I don't often get to a point where the project is about to go and someone reminds me of a trail. Usually I've like figured that out ahead of time. You have it on the map. It is remarkably hard to mark trails on the ground. It's something that is hard. You can hang up ribbons, you can spray paint things, you can have a very detailed map with pretty high GPS precision, but like it's really hard to protect like that single track mountain bike trail through a timber harvest. Like just really hard. And so in some cases, we have simply avoided, we've actually changed the silvicultural layout a little bit to simply avoid the trails. And we cross the trails at one point where we have to, but then we just, and we sacrifice a fair bit there in that the project is less efficient. The amount of wood that's getting managed is dramatically less, and so the economy of scale gets shrunk. So those are all things that like a landowner needs to kind of understand, or like a community forest, if you're doing something on that scale, like you definitely have to try to incorporate it. But I don't have like the perfect way to put those two things together.
Yeah, I mean, I just realized realize in this day and age, I worked here and that whole hillside, if Naomi talked to you
Yeah.
about North Branch, I mean, that's just laced with bike trails, ski trails, and I don't know what kind of forestry is happening.
Yeah, or is going to
on here.
happen.
Sean, somebody might know better if there's any, active forestry work or whether it's strictly being maintained for recreation because of people being right here.
Yeah, and another thing, like, I didn't get too deep into the particulars, but like a lot of the ecological forestry that I'm doing involves keeping snags, like big standing things that are dead, or laying down things and leaving them permanently that are dead. And so that can be not great for trails because people don't like things crashing down on their trails or across their trails. So there is a constant sort of conflict there.
You touched on invasives, and we have about 40 acres of mostly hardwood. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts would be on sort of the balances of managing invasives by hand, glossy buckthorn,
Yep.
non-native honeysuckle, wild carrot stuff. And just going through our mind of, maybe this is something we're going to be doing forever, or, are there, other treatments, chemical treatments that we try to not want to have to do, but at the same time trying to be sure that, the native species, and we've probably done, 3 major logging operations over the last 30, 40 years, try to keep that going and try to keep the stems coming.
Yep.
And I just, we're trying to figure out, maybe we're just going to commit to being in the woods all the time, pulling stuff. Or is there something easier to do? Maybe we don't want it to be easier.
Yep.
I'm just what landowners and what you've come across.
Yeah, I usually approach this thinking about other decisions that we make on the landscape. And I hate to go back to lawns, but like I like to think about lawns. So we choose to keep our lawns as lawns. And if you turn away and wait 30 years, like your lawn will not be a lawn anymore. It'll be a forest. Because like that's wonderful. We have an amazing resilient thing that will grab that growing space and grow. So we choose to maintain that thing. Same thing with gardens, same thing with like around our home environments. And as you build that out to a scale of like, do I want to be doing that on my 40 acres to manage the invasive plants to favor the native plant diversity? That's a question. And sometimes we'll come into a situation where no one has dealt with those plants for 60 years. And it's really heavy duty and pretty terrible. And there's nothing growing but invasive plants there. And you can see that like, this is not a healthy forest. Like this is not going to self-perpetuate. And in those cases, like, we will use primarily to start, we'll use huge forest mulching machinery. So like a big excavator with a shredding head that would have trouble fitting in this room essentially, to shred up those plants to get them down to something that, they'll then sprout back. And then we use chemicals, we do use herbicide on them. The trade-offs there are time, resources, and, I don't love the idea of putting chemicals out into the world, but I don't love the idea of invasive plants overrunning my forest either. And so I'm striking that balance or trying to. And if you have unlimited time or unlimited money and you want to attack those problems manually, it's doable. You can do it. But most people will find themselves in some middle ground where often it's like, I've got a 40-year issue to deal with here. I'm going to go pretty intense in years 1, 2, 3. And then after that, I'm going to weed my garden gently every year myself. So it's kind of a combination of all those things. And it depends on what you want to do. Like this past week, we had a machine mulching 20 acres of buckthorn that were this big. And it was just like, they're as tall as this room. And you're like, what are we doing here? Like, and we just put the shredder in there and said, and then we'll spray it when it sprouts because we really want to keep our herbicide use down, both for the land and also for people. So we'll put those things together. And then, if you do that, that's a demolition, right? Like but then you need to build something there. And so you need to keep after it with either planting or very focused, like, we also shredded a fair bit of dogwood and willow in and amongst those buckthorns this past week. So those will sprout back. We will not kill them when we go through there, so that we have something to kind of work with as we're filling that growing space. Because, you know, invasive plants are wicked good at taking over growing space and holding it. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. First of all, I came here to hear Alex speak. By the way, my name is Jed Lipsky. I serve in the legislature on the Agriculture and Forestry Committee. And I've been a logging contractor for 59 years. And I worked with Alex's grandfather, his father, and his mother. And the subject of ecological forestry is clearly cutting edge. It's not just some odd, new ideas. These ideas and the broad thinking that is trying to catch up with old traditional management and dealing with climate change, the need for biodiversity. But to the lady in the front who talked about the trail system, big picture of the 4.5 million forested acres in Vermont, 80% of them are privately owned. Many of those acres are in current use. 10% are federal and 10% are state forests. The primary demands in this time in history in Vermont, outdoor recreation is the largest growing sector in the Vermont economy. We are second in the world in the United States to the state of Hawaii as to outdoor rec's contribution to Vermont's gross domestic product. So foresters, forest owners, all of the incredible trail networks, whether for mountain biking in the Northeast Kingdom or in Katy Hill, my town of Stowe, and all over Vermont, are dependent on relationships with private landowners. Over 80% of the trail networks are courtesy cooperation with private owners and other organizations, mountain bike clubs, very important relationships. So the stewarding that's done on those properties, all of those considerations and relationships are critical. Additionally, songbird habitat, migratory, how a forester teaches loggers how and where certain birds or other game species, where they breed, where they nest, where they feed. It is, so there's also other wildlife, hunting, songbirds, outdoor recreation, carbon management, carbon sequestration, storage. By the way, forest products, that's also, that's a $1.4 billion industry in the state of Vermont. Historically, it was massive. It's diminishing, and as Alex allowed, we have a diminishing workforce, diminishing markets, and from a carbon perspective, we're feeding our own state. Locally sourced wood matters from an environmental perspective. So the work that Alex is doing and bringing into the profession, and for all of you that are landowners, is critical. We talked about Tony and Mondo. There's some great foresters. The state has its second climate resiliency forester on staff. She was in our committee today testifying. There's another Dr. Casebo's contracts in Vermont, which is with the Vermont.
Sir, let's let Alex
Okay.
respond to your comments.
So anyway, I just wanted to, respond. I think the responsibilities for foresters going forward in serving the landowners in a way that keep forests forested is critical. And as you carry on this tradition, I hope
Thank you.
you're what we can do.
how you weigh the balance of carbon. Like, how often do you chip and take that carbon off and let it get burned somewhere, or how often do you just chip it right there on the property, or do you not chip it all? Yeah, carbon. What do you think of these days?
Yeah, forest carbon is, was certainly not on the professor's mindset in 1954. So it's definitely a new thing that we're thinking about. And there are, programs that are developing around this, but it's I would still say it's pretty experimental in thinking, and there's a lot of great work being done by, the Family Forest Carbon Program and others. In my own work right now, like, the thing that I think about with carbon is, there's going to be fluctuations of trees coming and going on the landscape and the time frame that happens on. And I impact that with our work. And in some cases, we're going to be going into debt on the carbon ledger. And in some cases, we're going to be setting up that forest to be an amazing carbon sink for a long time. And I'm not a carbon scientist, and so the things that I'm mostly thinking about right now with carbon are growing, Vermont is really well suited to growing really awesome long-term trees, like 400-year-old beautiful hardwood pine and hemlock. And how can we maybe grow some of those trees for 200 years and then turn them into this beautiful cherry door in the back here for another 600 years? So balancing that, I obviously am very biased in this because I come from a family that makes wood products, but I do think about that a fair bit. And then I alluded to trying to not be too mechanistic about the forest. Like, I want the forest to be ecological and a little bit natural. And if you just want to maximize carbon on the forest, we would probably go back to that picture of the dudes with the brush saws, and we would very carefully turn all of our forests into carbon-sucking machines, and we would suddenly be disregarding biodiversity and recreation and all these other things in favor of carbon. And I don't really want to do that. And so I'm trying to take an ecological forestry approach to carbon management and say, let's have some continuity here, let's have some disturbance, let's be appropriate. The main thing with forest carbon, is that a lot of the current systems that people use are financial based, and they're trying to incentivize behavior. And that's a really tricky thing to do and measure for a forest. And around here, a lot of people are not touching their forests at all, and they're just developing very nicely. And there's lots of carbon sequestering there. And if we're going to try to just simply take credit for that thing that's happening already, that is a little discrediting to the idea of encouraging more carbon on the landscape. And, planting trees, like, this is going to add some carbon here. But like, if we wanted to fight climate change only on this 1 acre here, we would probably clear cut it and put up solar panels. Right? But we're obviously not going to do that across the whole landscape, and that's very tongue-in-cheek. But like, we got to be aware of carbon. Like, forests are going to be great to help climate change, but they're certainly not the only answer to that, is what I'd say.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. I'm going to steal one of them.
Excellent.
I'm really interested in just like you're talking about the messiness, and one thing that's revealing for me is you're not just your goal is not to just create messiness on the landscape for ecological function, but I was interested in kind of the messiness of the process of doing forestry, because you are this forest that has an intention where you're working with kind of like the scalpel to achieve an objective, but then that has to be passed like the game of telephone to a contractor or a series of contractors, and then you're also working with the landowner who has a different set of perceptions and understanding. And I'm wondering how that game of telephone often goes, and do you end up oftentimes where the projects end up the way you like them, or are there things that get lost in translation, and how precise can you be with project, recognizing that that there's going to be some messiness in the communications of this and who's involved?
Yeah, and things change along the way. At its core, like the way I structure my time in one of these projects is I work hourly. And so I'm clear with the landowner, I keep them posted, but I don't work on a percentage, which is a way that foresters often work, is a percentage of the wood that gets cut, they get paid. So I just get paid hourly because that allows me the flexibility to, so, one of those little clear cuts that we marked, right? In a typical forestry situation, you might have a map with the edges of it. You might have paint around the edges of it, but that's pretty quick. Like I can go lay out a 2-acre thing in, half an hour. But if I want to go lay it all out and then mark the trees that are going to get felled afterward, and I want to mark the trees that need to be girdled, and I want to mark a couple trees to leave, suddenly that's turned into a 2-hour thing. And so that's more expensive, and it's a process. But I've explained that to the landowner and hopefully got their buy-in that this is important and valuable. But it's not the difference between the 2 fancy pickup trucks, but it is, there's quite a bit of difference there in the cost. In terms of like memorializing that and communicating that to a contractor, I have the luxury in a lot of what I do of like some of the contractors are my coworkers. And so I have developed a relationship with them. I know what they like. I know how they operate. And I can communicate with them. Like I can send them a text message. They'll often be like in the cab sending me a picture of some tree being like, what am I doing with this thing? And like the technology is amazing, right? Because like 20 years ago, we couldn't do that. So like they'd have to make a decision and hopefully it was the right one. So technology is very helpful, working with the people. But we also I do work with contractors who are not part of our company. And we prepare a really detailed prospectus of the work. There's lots of bullet points, operator notes, but it's written, and it's only so good as people use it. There's now really available technology that everybody with their phone can just know where they are on a map. Like you don't need cell service or anything, right? But like you show it to people and then they just don't use it. And you're like, dude, why'd you go over there? Like, see, it's on the map. Or it's a lot of like, hey, I'm wrapping up the project. I've probably got another week here. And then the next morning, oh, I finished. And you're like, but you said it was going to be another week and I was going to come. Like, you just look at the map. So there is a lot of room for improvement there with just communication. In terms of like memorializing beyond a contract and actually thinking long term, like I certainly haven't figured that one out. Paint fades, marks fade on trees, intentionality fades. Forest pests come and go. Like there's a lot of unknowns into the future there, and I don't know how to mark that on the land. I've chosen to work at a forestry company, which has a goal of having multiple generations of foresters in the same company to try to provide some of that continuity. What I have observed is a lot of foresters will be a sole proprietor. They'll do their thing for a while. They'll do a bunch of wonderful work, and then they'll sort of like retire. And they should do that. It's important. But like having that handoff of information is mostly just done orally at this point.
We should probably wrap up there. I know that some folks have questions. You can stick around after and come up and ask. This is actually a really great segue talking about continuity. In a couple of weeks, we have Jess Weichel from UNPM Research Forest who's going to be here for our next natural experience presentation. And that talk's going to be all about managing forests for future threats, for long-term potential threats, forest pests, climate change, that sort of thing. And so I think that it'll be a great way to continue this conversation. Alex, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Building on what she was talking about with the recreational trails, like in our own forest, I've reconciled myself to messiness. I'm understanding that. But I still want to be able to walk
on your
our
trail.
roads.
Yeah.
Not just our trail, but
Yeah.
our roads.
We have existing roads from past.
Previous
Yep.
loggings,
Nice.
from
We've got
100 years ago.
250 acres.
Yeah.
But
Awesome.
he needs to be able to drive his tractor and
Yeah.
firewood. So what I'm imagining you saying is, okay, so we could tell the logger, leave our roads, don't drive on our roads.
Yep.
It's okay with us if you go make your other roads up there, because that's not where I'm
One
going.
thing a lot
Yeah.
of people can't drive on. Like we have one that follows a brook.
Yeah.
Use that.
You're like, please don't be there.
And there's other-
Yeah, I mean, I find that with the different, with the logging systems that I use a lot, with the cut to length, where they're putting a lot of brush where they're driving,
Yeah.
if they know they have to take it out later, that's important. They can do that. But if they don't know and you surprise them with that, it gets awkward.
Yeah.
Because it's expensive, and they can price that in. They can think about it ahead of